Welcome to Solid Rock, where we stress test the Gospels. We want to find out whether they are solid and reliable. My name is Matej Dobrossi, and I'll be speaking to my friend and neighbor, Peter Murfitt, and Timothy Bennick will be taking care of the technical aspects. Peter, before we actually start talking about the subject, can you please say a couple of words about your forthcoming book, which has the same title, Solid Rock?
Yep, it's going to be called Solid Rock, Stress Testing the Gospels, and a lot of the subjects that we'll be dealing with in these interviews will be treated in more detail in the book.
Okay, Peter, so tell us, why is this subject important?
Well, if we want to know about Jesus, the figure who towers over human history, we have to go to the Gospels. We can learn a little bit about Jesus of Nazareth from other historians and documents of the time, but not all that much. So anyone who wants to look at Jesus seriously has to go to the Gospels. So it's crucial to know whether they are reliable or not. Christians believe also that Jesus was and is the Son of God and is capable of transforming the hearts and minds of men and women. And that's the key to changing the world. So it is really crucial.
But why is it important to you? How did you get involved with this thinking, this research?
Well, although my main training is in science and engineering, and I've occupied important posts in research, industry and training adults, I'm also a kind of clandestine theologian or a New Testament historian. It all started in my fourth year at Cambridge University. I couldn't find anywhere else to stay but in a biblical research institute, and I couldn't think of anything much more boring than that. But there I lived, studied, ate and drank coffee under the same roof as many who are now eminent. They were all extremely kind and accessible, and I asked them and the PhD students who came for lunch many questions, often quite aggressively. They responded very graciously, so there I was, unbeknown to me, signed up for a dense course in biblical theology and the methods of biblical research. I doubt if many PhD students in theology have had better, more prestigious tutors than I did.
All right. What about the timing of this issue? I mean, why is this this special interest right now, do you think?
Well, there's been a sea change in gospel studies over the last few years, and some of the people I was with at Cambridge have been instrumental in bringing this about. It really hit the road in the 1990s. And secondly, a lot of new archaeological evidence has appeared over the last 50 years or so, which also impacts the studies of the Gospels.
Okay, what about give us a little bit a roadmap. How are we going to tackle these issues?
Well, today is a kind of introduction. We'll set the scene, if you like. Then for 2 sessions, we shall look at the ancient manuscripts of the New Testament and the Gospels. And by then it'll be nearly Christmas time, so we'll look at the Star of Bethlehem. Then in the new year, we'll come back to this sea change in gospel studies that I mentioned a moment ago, and we'll look at the origins of the Gospels, who wrote them, when and where they were written. This includes some new ideas which I've tried out on specialists in the area, so stay tuned to this space. There'll be more, but that's maybe enough for today.
Tell us a little bit more now, Peter, please. People are interested.
Well, one of the guiding things would be testing whether, on the one hand, the Gospels correspond with reality, and on the other hand, whether they are coherent within themselves. Do they describe the same events in the same places, and is their view of the person of Jesus basically the same? On the correspondence test, which is basically a reality check, we'll be checking that the Gospels square up with what we know of the time of Jesus from historians, archaeology, etc. But we'll come back to that in a later interview.
Which historians are we talking about?
Well, first of all, we're talking about the Roman secular historians. That's Tacitus, Suetonius, Pliny the Younger. Then there is the very interesting Jewish Roman historian, Flavius Josephus. His story is fascinating. He started off being one of the leaders of the Jewish revolt against the Romans from AD 66 to 74. But halfway through, he got captured by the future Emperor Vespasian, and he changed camps. He switched sides. So he knows both how the Romans crushed the Jewish revolt, but he also knows all about Jewish history, culture, and customs.
So he's the one who gives us a lot of information about the Jewish-Palestinian background to the Gospels?
Yeah, absolutely. After that come the courageous early Christians who wrote against a background of persecution, such as Papias, who wrote from AD 100 to AD 107, Irenaeus of Lyon, who wrote in about AD 180, Justin Martyr, and so on. We know them as the early church fathers. And finally, we mustn't forget Eusebius of Caesarea, who's known as the father of church history, who wrote between 290 and 300 AD.
So what's the time frame that we're talking about?
Well, we'll learn that Jesus from Nazareth was on earth between 7 BC and 30 AD. So his public ministry went from 20 to 30 AD.
So you're saying that Jesus was not born in 0 BC?
Yeah, that's one of these quirks of history. Around the time that Constantine came to power, a monk was mandated to calculate a new Christian calendar on the basis of the old Roman one. Unfortunately, he made some mistakes in his calculations. He forgot, for example, when Octavius ruled in Rome before actually having the title of emperor or Augustus.
What about the other historians that you mentioned? When did they write?
Well, Flavius Josephus died in AD 100, so he must have written between AD 80 and 100. Tacitus probably survived the Emperor Trajan in 117. Tacitus, Suetonius, and Pliny were all friends, actually, and they were probably all writing between AD 100 and AD 130. Then Papias wrote in AD 100 to 107, but he's recounting events that occurred in about AD 80. And then Irenaeus was a bit later, in AD 180, but he's a very important historical witness.
Why is Irenaeus so interesting?
Irenaeus was a bright lad, as an evangelist, as a theologian, as a textual critic, and he was extremely courageous, but that's not really the point. The point is the people he knew as a child and as a young man. He was born in Smyrna, near Ephesus, in modern-day Turkey. And his mentor was Polycarp, who died, as Irenaeus later did, as a martyr. Polycarp knew the Apostle John, who obviously knew Jesus. So therefore we have an unbroken chain of witnesses. We have Jesus, John the Apostle, Polycarp, and Irenaeus. Irenaeus also knew the elders in the church at Ephesus, who John the Apostle also knew. So that's yet another chain. That's Jesus, John the Apostle, the elders at Ephesus, once again Irenaeus. And there are other chains of witnesses like this that go back to Jesus and the people who had been healed by him. And one is from Quadratus in AD 130. So the idea that there was a big gap between the apostles and the early church is just not true. There's this continuous chain of historical witnesses.
Okay, so there's evidence from historians writing between 80 and 130 AD. With Irenaeus a little bit later on, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
But what about earlier evidence from secular historians who write nearer to the end of Jesus' time on earth, around AD 30?
Well, there's some evidence, but not much. Secular historian Thallus mentions the death of Christ in a work dating from AD 52, and a Syrian called Bar Scipion wrote to his son sometime after AD 73, also mentioning the death of Christ.
So let's talk a little bit about the how the early Christians lived.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what were the churches like at the earlier times?
Well, let's consider to begin with, if you like, the very early church, say between the ascension of Jesus and the martyrdom of Peter and Paul in AD 65. One of the best indications of what the early church was like comes at the end of Paul's epistle to the Romans in chapter 16, which was written in AD 57. There Paul greets at least 6, if not 10, independent households or churches. These are small groups of believers maybe 10 groups of 10, or maybe much more, we don't know, meeting in the houses of Priscilla and Aquila, Andronicus and Junia, Narcissus, and so on. And the same was true in Corinth, in Thessalonica, and places like this. And the specialists who look at this can even put names to the leaders of these various household churches. Archaeological studies also show, and it's really quite widespread, it can be Syria on the one hand, or it can be even England on the other. And it shows that before Constantine came to power, all the Christian worship was occurring in houses. Sometimes they became quite big houses. And then when Constantine came to power, he started building purpose-built buildings or basilicas for Christian worship.
These early prayer groups, did they have any scriptures to help them in their worship?
Well, if they were fortunate, they might have had access to a scroll of the Old Testament. And we have them using the Psalms in Colossians chapter 3. But they were creative people, and they soon started making up their own anthems, spiritual songs, and so on. And we can find traces of some of these spiritual songs and anthems in Paul's letters. We think we can see one, for example, in Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 to 11.
So the Gospels did not really spread as written word to begin with?
No, it's quite clear from the Acts of the Apostles that the Gospel spread like wildfire right around the Mediterranean, but it was spread by preaching and by miracles. And then Paul started writing the New Testament with his letter to the Galatians in AD 49. The elders in Jerusalem got in on the act by writing a letter after the Council of Jerusalem. That was the winter of AD 49-50. We read that in Acts 15. Then Paul's 2 letters to the Thessalonians followed quite swiftly. And then in AD 55, we have the big guns. We have 1 Corinthians, Paul's letter to the Corinthians, and we probably have the first Semitic version of Matthew's Gospel. And that means that by the time that Paul and Peter were martyred in AD 64-65, we have most of the New Testament written, apart from Revelation, John's Gospel, and the epistles of John.
So if I get it right, if the Gospel was not a written word to begin with, doesn't this mean that the message could have changed, mutated as it went around the Mediterranean?
No, but it's a good question, and there are 2 important points here. First of all, we have to get rid of from our minds the idea that the Roman Empire was some kind of primitive society. Communications in the Roman Empire were extremely good. We all know these great big Roman roads that crisscrossed the empire. The emperors and the central administration in Rome even had their own courier services for communicating with the devolved provincial governors and proconsuls and the military, of course. And there was even a special fleet of grain ships organised by the state to bring grain from Egypt to feed Rome. So communications in the Roman Empire were excellent. And secondly, as Peter Williams from Cambridge University points out, the fact that the message really went round the Mediterranean so quickly just means that there simply wasn't time for it to change.
All right, Peter. So today we have laid down the groundwork. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. We've got lots of information from Flavius Josephus on the Jewish and Roman background to the Gospels. Then we have some information from the Roman historians Tacitus and Suetonius, but not that much. And then the fathers of the early church click in with their unbroken chains of witnesses like Papias and Irenaeus. And with all this information, archaeological evidence, we can test the correspondence of the Gospels with reality. Then further on, we shall examine the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, to make sure they recount the same events in the same places. There'll be some new ideas there too.
Okay, so what next?
Well, this time we've seen how gradually the apostles got into the business of writing. Next time we shall see how books were published at the time, how we receive the Gospels, how they've come down to us through the various ancient manuscripts.
That seems a little bit dull and dusty. I'm sure it's going to be more exciting than that.
Yeah, it will be. No, it's interesting. You'll be interested in it, and we'll also be thinking about how the Gospels came together.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Thank you for our viewers. So, hope you enjoyed that. And please get ready for the next episode. And we're going to be looking at how the Gospels came together and the evidence of the ancient manuscripts.